Really, I try to do things once they can. It's weird 'cause it sounds like I'm on it now, but now if I forget it, come back on it. That's what I'll do. Okay, give me 2 seconds. I'm just going to do a speed test on it, because then it's whether or not they take the Wi-Fi or that. So right. Just get that one off of the Wi-Fi.
So it's members.
Yeah.
And then capital P.
Yeah.
There's portcullis. But it's M&S, it's the 5 at the end.
Check it out. Hold on.
Whee. That looks pretty speedy.
That was really quick and it's fast. That might the difference between a usable live and a non-usable live. Uploaded good was that's uploaded one. No, it's not the standard one up there. That's really good.
Kill that.
Hello.
But can you do that with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's got it's a simple load up page like that.
Sorry, watch out for those wires.
Yes, I will do. Thank you very much.
Hello, 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 hello. Hello.
very frustrating. It was on it, but it wasn't passing anything through.
How bad was the one with the Wi-Fi?
It was not doing very much at all, but if this doesn't really get anything, it's better than something or nothing, right? So I'll give it another minute and see if it kicks up a page or not. And if it doesn't, then I'll just do this instead.
Stop it.
How you doing?
Hi, Father. How are you doing? How are you? How are you? You okay?
Fine, how are you?
Thank you. Hi. Thanks for coming.
Hello, everybody. Can everyone hear me all right at the back? Yeah, good. That's great. Good. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Westminster. My name is Alison McGovern, and I'm the Labour Member of Parliament for Wirral South, and it's a pleasure to see you all here today. I want to thank you all. For those who are not from Westminster, I want to thank you for coming to Westminster to hear our speaker this afternoon, and for those who work in Westminster, particularly members of the PLP, I want to thank you for welcoming a former member of the PLP back to Parliament. Before I introduce Gordon properly, I just want to say a couple of things, and there'll be an opportunity for reflections after Gordon has spoken, so do think about making a contribution. But when it comes to my friend Gordon Brown, some people have been saying lately that we had 40 years of neoliberalism and that Gordon had the same values as Margaret Thatcher. But I think that can't be true because she's never even been to Wraith Rovers. That's a niche Scottish football joke for you. But when it comes to values, actually, values are best understood not by what you say, but by what you do. And it's not even what you do. It's what you get done. And Thatcher oversaw a huge increase in inequality and a massive rise in child poverty. In contrast, Gordon oversaw a flattening of inequality and the rescue of 1 million children from poverty. And yes, indeed. And the fact is, we know this in the Parliamentary Labour Party because some of the people, as mums, who received those tax credits that had such an impact felt so strongly about it, they decided to become Labour members of Parliament.
Good.
So that perhaps explains the attendance here today. So from the past to the future, in progressive politics right now, people are hurting. They're hurting from an election that was brutal. They're hurting from the past decade. And we're hurting from brutal divisions in society too. And that's why I'm pleased to have Gordon here speaking with hope, not hate. And for some of us, there was a day in June in 2016 that was the worst day in Labour politics that we can ever imagine. And we know that it's the people at Hope Not Hate who were there from that day helping us through that. Wherever there are divisions or dark moments in society, Hope Not Hate are there, helping us to understand and to campaign against division. So if you enjoy the speech today, I'd ask you all to think about joining me as a supporter of Hope Not Hate. If you go onto their website and click join, you'll be able to sign up to support them. So please think about doing that. Finally, in dealing with division and with hurt, we know we have to move on. We owe the country more than our grief. We owe it a plan. We owe the country more than an internal Labour battle. We owe it a battle for the future of the UK. And more than anything else, we owe our country leadership and strength. Speaking of which, Gordon Brown.
Thank you. Can I say... Can I say, first of all, thank you for welcoming me back as a recovering politician, and say that it's a great pleasure to be introduced by Alison. Let me congratulate her on her 6,000 majority in Wirral. and say she is a marvellous supporter of women's equality. And while so many things went wrong in the last few months, one thing that has happened is that for the first time in history, in a main party, the majority are women members of Parliament, and Labour has managed to achieve that. And Harriet, I want to thank you for what you did to achieve that. Rosie, Angela, and all of you for what you've done to achieve the first party in history where the majority of members of Parliament are women. And I want also to welcome new members here and new members of staff. I came in 1983. Harriet was actually already there. I think Nick, who's here, we were at this meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party in 1983. I started off with no desk, with no telephone, no office. And at the end of the first week in Parliament, the end of the first week, I picked up a copy of the Times, and they were describing all the new members of Parliament. And they described me, Gordon Brown, 56-year-old, elderly, born 1926. And then The Guardian, I think, picked me up as the veteran Labour MP. Then I was the stalwart MP in the Mail. And then I got a letter from a pension company saying I'd taken a new job late in life and would be preparing for an early retirement. And the reason was, of course, there were so many Browns in the House of Commons. There were more Browns than Liberals or SDP at that time. And then I went to the meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Michael Foot stood up and he quoted George Bernard Shaw about the reactions to the first night of a very unsuccessful play. And he said the performance was excellent, but the audience was poor. His reflection on the general election. He then said later that in 1945, the great electors of Plymouth, Devonport, voted me in as a Member of Parliament. And in 1950, the bastards threw me out. But it was to make a point that we had to listen to the electorate. You could not re-elect the electorate. And everybody here should never forget how we felt the night of that general election only a few weeks ago. And we should be determined never to allow that to be repeated again. Now, I want to speak today about what's happening round the whole of the United Kingdom. I want to say that we have to renew Britain and remake it, or we're in danger of losing it. I want to say that the constitution of this country has got to be reformed fundamentally, or we are in danger of seeing the secession of Scotland and indeed the regions never really feeling at home again in this over-centralised United Kingdom. For 50 years, when I was started off as a student, people talked about the decline of Britain. You know, they said in the 60s that we managed decline, in the 70s we mismanaged decline, in the 80s we declined to manage. But now we're actually talking about the risk of the disintegration of the United Kingdom. And I think we should think very seriously about what we need to do about this. Boris Johnson yesterday started floating proposals to move the House of Lords from London to York or Birmingham or Leeds. He started floating proposals to rotate members of Parliament moving around the country. But I tell you, cosmetic changes will not make the difference that is needing to be made. And we've got to think, and Labour should be leading this debate about what we do in the future. I remember a Scottish Secretary of State who decided that he would, with cosmetic measures, get the Conservative Party back in Scotland in 1996. And so he started wearing kilts and tartans. He then had bagpipes surrounding him every speech that he made. He then drove the Stone of Destiny back from London into Scotland across the Tweed to take it into Scotland with a military pipe band alongside him, took it to Edinburgh Castle in floodlights to show it off, and he lost every seat in Scotland at the next general election. We have got to think very carefully about what we do, and we've got to think too about how constitutional issues are very difficult and very complex, and what we must do in thinking about them is think deeply and not superficially, looking simply for cosmetic changes. The great problem of the United Kingdom, we've got to recognise, and we did not do enough to recognise this, is not only that we are a multinational country that has existed within a unitary state for hundreds of years, but it's an asymmetric system where the vast majority of votes are, of course, in one of the four nations in England, and at the same time, it's over-centralised with most of financial, political, administrative power in one city in the south of the country. And that is an explosive cocktail when people start to rebel and say that they do not want to be part of an arrangement that is so over-centralised that they feel it is remote and distant from them. In the 19th century, the great problem in the constitution that people talked about was the Schleswig-Holstein question, which was this problem about the communities of Schleswig and Holstein and whether they're going to be independent of Germany or independent of Denmark, and what was to be the constitutional relationship with them. And Palmerston, 150 years ago, said that there was only three people that had ever worked out an answer to the question. He said one had died, one who was a law professor had gone mad, and he was the third person, and he had forgotten what the answer was. The problem about our modern constitution is I don't think anybody yet knows the answers, and we've got to start listening to the people to find out. So you start with the election, what your interpretation is of it, what you think actually happened there. And the Conservatives may be telling us now that this is a newfound stability that we've achieved in the country, that you could put electoral politics on hold for 5 years because they've got a huge 80 majority. I don't interpret it that way. I interpret this as a signal that people are not at ease with the country, that they're not even at ease with the government. I don't think there is any evidence of a newfound post-Brexit unity about to happen in this country. I don't think there's a great deal of evidence that there's a consensus emerging about what the future of our country is likely to be and whether people can support it. And I think we're in very difficult territory. People are more individualist in the way that they express their votes. Local and religious loyalties are less important than they used to be. People are more instrumental and independent in the way they express their votes. Most people do not associate themselves directly now with a political party as being attached to that political party. People are more instrumental. Boris Johnson himself admitted that people were lending him their votes in the north, as he put it. But I think, and I think we've got to look at this very carefully, that the bigger lens, the clearer lens through which to look at the United Kingdom at the moment is the power of competing nationalisms. Brexit nationalism. After all, it's national independence from Europe. And of course, 50 million came from England. Scottish nationalism, Welsh nationalism, Irish nationalism, Ulster nationalism. When you think of it, you've got a Brexit getting done is leaving Britain undone, and at the same time you're destabilising the relationships between the different interests in Ireland, between, if you like, Britishness and Irishness in Ireland, and you're putting at risk the whole of the United Kingdom. Now, this is a phenomenon not just in the UK. This is now a phenomenon across the whole of the Western world. If you think of it this way, 10 years ago, we had a financial crisis, and everybody came together, the high watermark of cooperation across the world in dealing with economic problems. In the last 10 years, what we've seen is a defensive nationalism illustrated by protectionism, higher tariffs, people building walls, creating borders, stopping immigration. That is protectionism that has been the feature as countries have retreated into national silos. And then take what's happening now. America first, Russia first, Turkey first, India first, China first, all these countries pursuing what I would call not just protective nationalism, but aggressive nationalism. And of course the danger is we have Scotland first, England first, Wales first, and so on in the United Kingdom. And if you look at these nationalist movements across Europe, you've got in Eastern Europe, since 1989, countries subdividing into ethnic enclaves. And if you look at all the referendums, all the movements of countries are becoming far more homogeneous in the populations in Eastern Europe. And then if you look at Western Europe in the last 2 or 3 years, what you've seen is the rise of nationalist parties. Even in Sweden, a strong nationalist party, Germany, France, Italy. If you look at all these countries, you see the rise of a block of nationalist parties. And the danger is that the theme of the next 20, 30, 40 years is going to be a history of divisive nationalisms, even across a European Union that was expecting to be federal at some point when they started off the process, but is now a European Union that rightly so is a Europe of nations and states, but is a European Union that is at risk at some point of nationalism taking over. look at what's happening in Hungary, for example. Remember that poster that was done in 2016 by Nigel Farage, Breaking Point. I remember it because sadly it was the day that we heard that Joe Cox was assassinated. But remember that poster, Breaking Point, where they took these photographs of people that were supposedly trying to get into Europe. They removed all the white faces, they removed all the women from the part of the photograph you could see, and Nigel Farage called it Breaking Point. Go to the Hungarian elections of 2019, only a few months ago. Exactly the same photograph being used in Hungary. The same photograph, the same impression trying to be created. They changed the headline from Breaking Point to Stop. But here you have, right across Hungary, an attempt in a country that has got very few immigrants to have immigration as the issue of the election. In fact, they say in Hungary they've now got more anti-immigrant parties than they have immigrants themselves. And that is a reflection of how Orban has tried with the authoritarian nationalism to run the country. Just give you another example, Italy. Look at what's happening in Italy. I happen to know Berlusconi and deal with him when we had the G20 in London and at various other points. He was, if you like, one of the first populist nationalists in Europe, complaining about the European Union, complaining about the euro, of course, at the same time, anti-immigrant policies in Italy. But Berlusconi was not as dangerous a populist nationalist as some of the others who have now followed him in Italy. I was actually at one of the G meetings with Sarkozy chairing and Angela Merkel there, and we had Barroso, the President of the European Commission, and we had Berlusconi, and we were discussing what we would do in the first days of the financial crisis. We were meeting in Paris, and we had this meeting, and I was saying, look, Europe's got as big a problem as America, we're better do something about it. Europeans were not so sure that they had this problem at this stage. Berlusconi said absolutely nothing. And so for about an hour and a half we discussed, and then we broke for coffee, and suddenly we had Berlusconi saying, amateurs, in his French. Say so, amateurs. And people thought, Berlusconi, he's got the answer to the financial crisis. We're all amateurs, this guy's professional. He knows what to do. And then suddenly he says, amateurs, he said, don't they realize we've got a press conference in half an hour? And none of them have brought makeup artists with them. But Berlusconi, populist, outdone by more extreme populists, Salvini, who then became leader of the Northern League in Italy, anti-immigrant policies, anti-European policies, and then Salvini, he is in danger of being overtaken by the Brothers of Italy, which is the neo-fascist movement in Italy, which won a lot of votes in the European elections. So once you start down this populist nationalist road, it's very difficult to see where it will actually end. And think of what might happen in Britain. I would have thought that if you get to a situation where Scotland was independent, Scotland could not afford the resources for a separate pound, which it's trying to create. We have years and years of austerity. They would still be blaming the SNP, England, or the rest of the United Kingdom for what's going wrong. You would see pressure then from the Irish border poll. You'd see a more aggressive Welsh nationalism. You'd see England retreating into itself. And just think of this, Boris Johnson at the next election, what does he do? Within a neoliberal framework, he's trying to reconcile two groups of voters. The North that wants spending and investment, and it needs desperately spending and investment on services. The Southern Shires that want lower taxes, and therefore lower public spending and a smaller state. How does he then reconcile these two within his neoliberal philosophy? And how does he unite these constituencies for a future election? Play the nationalist card. And that is the danger that we face. Play the anti-European card again. Play the anti-immigrant card. Play the anti-Scottish card, because that was played both in the 2015 and the 2019 election, suggesting the SNP would form a coalition with Labour and somehow Scotland would control England. And that was a nationalist message that was being conveyed by the Conservative Party. And that's where it goes. You see, in my view, Orwell was right, George Orwell, when he made this distinction between patriotism and nationalism. Patriotism is the love of your country, he said. Patriotism responds to the need for people to feel that they can identify with a place and that they are part of a community, belong to a community. Patriotism is about I and having identity, about us and having a sense of community. Nationalism, he said, is about us versus them. It's about life seen as a permanent struggle between us and them, the outsider, the outgroup, anybody who you therefore can label as someone who's holding you back. And it invents enemies where none exist. It creates and manufactures resentments, even if they're imagined more than real. It is absolutist because it's forcing you all the time to make a choice. Are you Scottish and British? No, you've got to be Scottish or British. Are you British, Welsh, British and European? No, you've got to make a choice. You can be only one of these three things. And that is the problem about nationalist ideology, that it creates a them and us situation, which is always blaming someone else for what goes wrong. I remember with Lula, during the financial crisis, I went down to see him in Brazil, and he gave this press statement, and he said, when I was a trade union leader, he said, when things really went wrong, and people asked me who's to blame, I said the government. He said, when I became the leader of the opposition, and people asked me who's to blame, things are really bad, I said, blame the government. And then he said, and then I became the government. And people said, things are still going wrong. And I said, people said, who's to blame? And he said, America. Blaming someone else for what is going wrong, manufacturing resentments where none exist. And this is the power of nationalism that we have got to combat, whether it's Brexit nationalism, Scottish nationalism, or whether it's any other forms of nationalism across the world. And the question then is, how has all this happened? You see, 19th century and 20th century nationalism, in my view, was people complaining about cultural discrimination, political exclusion, economic exploitation by one nation over another. 21st century nationalism, what we're seeing now, is quite different, although it threatens to dominate the next 20 or 30 years of our politics. It is economic insecurity that is driving things. It is cultural fears about what's happening to our country. People saying our country's not what it used to be. It's changed out of all recognition. It's anti-politics sentiment. They're all out for themselves. You know that. Globalization is out of control. Let's take back control. And that's the sort of things that people are saying about what's happening. And in Britain's case, I think the nationalists are able to exploit something also. The post-war social contract is breaking down. You can see it everywhere. It was built on 4 assumptions. First, that work would pay. And work doesn't actually pay for millions of people. 2/3 of the children in poverty today are children in poverty when their father or mother is in work, and often in full-time work, and often 2 members of the family in work and still in poverty. The second assumption was there was opportunity for all. If you strive hard, there was upward mobility, and people do not feel that the next generation is going to do it as well as the last. Third one was that high pay was justified if people showed merit or worked hard or showed effort. And you cannot say that boardroom remuneration, you cannot say executive pay, you cannot say that bankers' bonuses, you cannot say the extremes in inequality in income in any country at the moment are justified on the basis of merit or hard work or effort. And finally, the safety net is collapsing. You can see it in every area. In my old constituency, I can see what's happening. You're dependent on food banks, you're dependent on bedding banks, you're dependent on clothes banks, you're dependent on baby banks, you're dependent on charity, and the safety net is being thrown aside as the welfare state is in retreat. And the regional inequalities in our country are now greater than in most parts of Europe. The inequalities between the North and London are greater than between most states in the United States of America. And people, in my view, feel that they are undervalued. They feel that the work they did used to have status. If you were a manufacturing worker, you could have pride in the product you made. If you were a miner, you could have pride in the fact you were lighting up the country and providing the energy that was needed. And now people feel that the jobs they have are insecure, 0 hours, they don't have the status that they should have, and they are not valued. Only in the National Health Service, and increasingly so because of regional and class inequalities, do people feel that they have any chance of being treated as equal citizens. And this is what we are having to respond to. If 19th century nationalism was based on cultural discrimination and political exclusion and economic exploitation, today's nationalism is actually nationalists able to exploit economic insecurity, cultural worries, anti-politics sentiment. Globalization has somewhat failed, and you need to take back control. And we have to have a positive alternative to that, because nationalism cannot solve the problem by putting up a few more flags or by changing the borders, or by the simple act of leaving the European Union, the idea that the Conservatives have got across that on January 31st, somehow something fundamentally changes in terms of people's living standards, when they know that the most likely change over a few months is that people's living standards will not rise, but will actually fall. And that's why the decision to leave the European Union for millions of families in the north will prove to be one of the decisions that actually affects and undermines their economic progress and their standards of living. But we then have to have a positive alternative. What is that? I don't think you can have that positive alternative without dealing with these issues of economic security. I think you've got to talk about the opportunities and have policies for opportunities for the future, but I'll not talk about that today. I don't think you can deal with this without having policies for dealing with the real fears that people have about migration, and they've got to be dealt with. You've got to take this argument on, and you cannot avoid it anymore. And the worst foreign policy negotiation that ever happened in the post-war years was David Cameron's negotiation with Brussels in 2016, when he didn't even raise the issues that could have protected many jobs in this country without sacrificing freedom of movement. You know, if we'd done what the Germans did and say, you can come to the country, but after 9 months, if you don't have a job, you have to leave. If we'd done what the French do and say you cannot have social dumping, if we'd done what the Swiss within freedom of movement do as an associate of the European Union and said that jobs had to be advertised at local labour exchanges in high unemployment areas first before they could be advertised abroad, if we'd done what the Germans are planning to do, have a minimum wage floor right across Europe and argued for that, then we might have been able easily to win the referendum on these issues. But his failure in negotiation caused us to lose that referendum, and I'm absolutely certain of that, and it's something we've got to face up to. But the main thing I think we've got to think today about is how we can ensure that there is a voice for the regions and nations. If you talk about moving parliaments here and there, you're not going to get anything other than people saying these are changes of presentation and not substance. But if we could have a policy, and I think it's Labour that's going to drive this policy, that says that regions and cities and towns in this country can become centres of initiative, centres of decision-making in their own right. They get centres of new industries because we'll help finance them. We will support them being cultural centres for not just our country, but for the whole of Europe. And if we could inject that into the debate, that it's not just about resources, it's also about making sure the voice of the regions and nations is properly heard, then I think we are at the beginning of something quite different. I personally would favour a constitutional convention, bring together people from all regions and nations to look at the future of the British Constitution. I would favour the creation of citizens' assemblies, region by region, because that would allow people, as happened in Ireland, and I've looked at what happened in the abortion debate, it would allow people to look in depth at issues as members of the public, interrogate people, get the evidence, get the facts, and then decide what their position was. And you know in Ireland, it fundamentally changed the debate about abortion by having these citizens' assemblies, because people could look at the evidence dispassionately, and the heat, and indeed in some cases the violence of that debate was removed, and people cannot say that Ireland has not been able to deal with that problem and move forward without that bitterness surviving in its country. So I would set up region by region citizens' assembly to hear the voices of what people are saying. I create a council, a forum of the regions and nations. I think the next second chamber, when it's finally changed, is going to be a Senate of the nations and regions, and this could be a forerunner of it. And I would give it powers to look at some of the important issues that arise from Brexit, where you cannot say that when you transfer powers from Brussels to Westminster, you cannot say that that's where powers should be located. There's got to be evolution of some of these powers, otherwise Westminster and Whitehall have even more centralisation of power than they have now. If I was a Northern MP, I would be arguing at the moment for a Council of the North, bringing together MPs, councillors, mayors, and looking at the resources in the North and how they could be allocated. And I've been trying to tell the Treasury to devolve decisions about the allocation of resources in the North to the North, indirectly elected perhaps, but from elected councillors, MPs and mayors. I do the same in the Midlands if there was a demand for it. I do the same in the South West if there was a demand for it. And if the government didn't give in to these demands that these things be created, I would create a pressure group bringing together Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland and the regions of England. Now up against one region and against one city, the Chancellor, as I know, and the Prime Minister, as I know, can divide and rule. But if they come together, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and the regions, their demands could be irresistible, and of course each would have a new status and a new power of decision-making within the United Kingdom. As for Scotland, it seems to me that the Scottish National Party have tried for years after years and years and said they were going to create a majority for independence in Scotland, but they have not managed to do it. They won a majority of seats on the first-past-the-post system. They got 45% of the vote, but that is exactly the same vote as they got in the referendum of 2014. And I don't think Scotland can be united as long as that proposal of the nationalists is on the table and they are demanding that that reflects the views of the people of Scotland. It simply does not reflect the views. There is not a clear majority. There is not a decisive majority. There is not even an overwhelming majority, as they would argue, for independence at the moment. And the danger in Scotland is we're caught between two positions: a no-change unionism, status quo, and independence, which is where the nationalists want the debate to be. If you want change, you've got to vote for independence because there's no other option for change. We have got to look at post-Brexit, how the powers of the Scottish Parliament have got to be improved, given that we are post-Brexit, and we have got to talk about powers that have been transferred from Europe to Whitehall, some of which should come to the Scottish Parliament. We've got to put the Scottish case for a UK that works for Scotland by the reform of the United Kingdom, and we've got to talk about working together. We've got to talk about what binds us together: Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, the regions of England, and what we can do by working together, the case that has not really been put over these last few years. We've got to rediscover, in my view, the value of empathy, not enmity between nations. We've got to rediscover the importance of cooperation and not conflict. We've got to understand and rediscover how central it is to have reciprocity between different countries, that if I can help you, you can help me. And we've got to also talk again about solidarity between the different parts of the United Kingdom, about how we can work together. Just think of it this way. We're going to have a COP26 conference in Glasgow in the next few months. The very idea that we're just going to split up into 4 nations and argue our own separate corner on an environmental issue where we know pollution is no respecter of borders is simply ridiculous. The only way we could deal with environmental issues is by cooperating together. The need to deal with the ecological problems we have and to have a sustainable environment requires us to cooperate. It is actually the only way forward that we can deal with the environmental challenges of the future. Take the National Health Service. It's 4 nations, regionally administered, in England as well. But it's one big idea of Attlee and Bevan and the Labour government of 1945. And the idea is that in any part of the United Kingdom, irrespective of whether you're Scottish, English, Welsh or Northern Irish, you can get access to the National Health Service, and the health service is there to treat you equally on equal terms, irrespective of your money, but dependent on your need. When we have blood transfusions, and blood is donated by people, they don't ask, is it going to a Scottish or Welsh or Irish or English patient? When you have organ donations and people donate their organs, and under the new legislation that Jeffrey Robinson passed to his credit, we now have the facility to have far more organs donated to save lives. Again, people don't ask, is it going to a Scottish or Welsh or Irish or English patient? People understand that the idea of the National Health Service is that these resources are shared across the whole of the United Kingdom. And if we, the Labour movement, fail to get back to this argument that cooperation and solidarity and reciprocity and empathy matters, we will be failing the people of this country, because it is the only way forward in the modern world. John Kennedy, before he died, gave a very important speech in the 1960s in America, in Philadelphia, where the original Declaration of Independence was agreed. And he actually said then, 50 and more years ago, that the Declaration of Independence was one thing in Americans' history, but what we now needed was a declaration of interdependence, of how nations and regions could work together for common purposes, the only way, he said, that we could build the future of this world. I think we need to rediscover that interdependence is the way forward for not just our country and Europe, but for the rest of the world. I think we need to understand that the heart of an interdependent country is the principles of cooperation, solidarity, and reciprocity. I think only the Labour movement can actually rebuild this country around these principles. I think the task for all of us is to understand that this country is not at ease with itself. This country wants change and was voting for change whether we like what they voted for and who they voted for or not. That we are the only party, the only movement that can build an interdependent Britain based on solidarity, cooperation, reciprocity and empathy between peoples, and that is a challenge that it is our duty, in my view, to meet. Thank you very much.
Change starts here. So I'm going to ask if anybody would have any reflections on what Gordon has said. And without further ado, Harriet, can I come to you first? I'm going to come to Harriet, and then I think we've got Ian Murray at the back and Chris Bryant as well. Harriet, let me give you the mic. Harriet.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Gordon, for that extraordinary speech. And I think it's not just your forensic analysis and your mapping out the processes underpinned by your principles on the question of nations and regions and nationalism and the dangers that we face at the moment. But it's also that I think that we face very much a dangerous moment with a very devastating rejection by the electorate of the Labour Party. And with the leadership election underway and a background against divisions in the party, there's the temptation to kind of hibernate until something happens, that somehow we get a new leader who will save us, or somehow we'll be on the brink of an election that we somehow might win. And in the meantime, people's confidence goes down, their heads go down, and their sense of hope ebbs away. And I think what you've done is a terrific example of showing the confidence that the left and Labour has the answers and inspires us to work together to go forward on those, but also to speak up on them so that people out there all around the country and its different parts know that it's not just cultural right-wing hegemony from Boris Johnson and his government, that there are arguments out there that understand the problems and that will work together to solve them. So thank you. It's been a real tonic hearing you today, and I guess we've all got to up our game.
Thank you. Ian. I've got Ian. Great.
Gordon, thank you very much indeed. If you're looking for the epitome of what nationalism has done to Scotland, he's currently standing here with a microphone. I absolutely agree with everything you've just said, with the exception of the bit about Wraith Rovers that we'll never agree on, as you know. But the question really for me in the comment is this. We may be passing you on the way down, actually. The comment is really this. The language of Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, to a certain extent, is exactly the same language that we hear from the Scottish nationalists, the Welsh nationalists and nationalism all over the world. It's about taking back control. It's about finding that division and grievance. But one of the big messages we got from the election on the 12th of December as a Labour movement is many of the regions and nations of the UK felt that the Labour movement was no longer either talking to them, listening to them or representing them. And one of the key drivers has to be to re-engage with the nations and regions of the UK and to give power closest to the people that require it in order for them to transform their own lives. It's not about changing the brass plaques of where the Treasury sits or where the House of Lords sits, but actually sending the power and the accountability and the responsibility to deliver services and government for people's own lives. So the key task is how we do that. The biggest issue that I've always had when I've been banging on about this for years now and boring everyone in the Parliamentary Labour Party about it is how we deal with England. Because Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, to a certain extent, are much more advanced in terms of that devolution journey. The big, of course, task in those devolved nations is that Innismon is as far away from Cardiff as Fort William is from Edinburgh, and how we deal with more devolution within those nation-states. But how do we deal with England, and how do we make sure that the voice of people in the regions of England who feel as if the Labour movement haven't been listening to them are now being listened to?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask Chris Bryant and then Angela Regal, and then Gordon, if you would respond, that would be lovely. Chris.
I'm microphoneless, but it may be all right. Gordon, I wonder whether you think of standing for leader of the party. No, serious point, that I think, as a Welsh MP, in the last election, one of the ironies was that it felt like a very, very centralised campaign. It hadn't been devolution-proofed. You'd hear things on the news every day, and you think, well, I don't know, is that meant to apply in Wales or not? And so that seemed a major problem. But my bigger anxiety is that we, the Labour Party, have become a grievance machine rather than a source of hope. And it seems to me that's the fundamental difference between, like, a Scottish national, a Welsh nationalist, and the Labour Party, that we might both be arguing, sometimes I would disagree that it is socialism that you're getting from those nationalists, but they would argue that they're arguing for socialism, but just as a grievance machine. And the key to that was, for the last 10 years, what successive Tory chancellors did was they devolved decision-making theoretically, but basically the decisions about making the cuts. So they were never accountable for the cuts. The local councillors or the regional bodies were responsible for the cuts. So how do we make sure that we return to being an engine for hope rather than just grievance?
Okay, Angela.
Thank you. Gordon, I think one of the paradoxes of what you've pointed out today is actually that nationalism is now a globalised, coordinated right-wing movement which uses the same posters even across different countries to sort of stir up the politics of grievance that you've outlined so well today. And the only answer, as you have said, is for us to go back to the basics of our values. And you've mentioned some of those: solidarity, empathy, cooperation. You've talked today about a constitutional resettlement, with which I don't think anyone in this room could disagree. But how do you think that we can get back to talking about our values? Because I don't think that the social democratic parties in Europe or elsewhere in the world have really managed to get round the problems that were caused by the fall of the Berlin Wall. And since that was in 1989, it's about time we dealt with it.
It is. One final one, if I may. I'll just bring in Charlie Faulkner.
Excellent speech. The thing I find troublesome, though, is you've described the problems as being economic insecurity, cultural identity. You suggest that what we do is reopen the Constitution of the United Kingdom in a period of economic insecurity and cultural identity issues. The moment you big time open out the Constitution for debate again, what everybody goes for is the most populist, radical alternative, believing it will change their lives, just as they did in relation to the EU referendum, and got quite close, surprisingly close to doing it, and you've played a huge part in preventing this happening, in concluding that Scotland should be independent. Should we much more be focusing in the UK on how you prevent London being the centre of everything economic, much more on the economic and cultural issues that you've identified as the problem, rather than on the constitutional issues? Because the moment you focus on the constitutional issues, you play straight in to the Scottish National Party and other nationalist movements.
Well, thank you, Charlie, and thanks for all the questions. And Harriet, we would be far less well protected in dealing with the Conservatives if we hadn't had the Equality Act that you pioneered through. Thank you again for being here. Angela, to put the situation, we have now got an international coalition of anti-internationalists. We've got Steve Bannon organising this across Europe. You can see his effects in Spain with this Vox movement that tried to derail Pedro Sanchez, the socialist prime minister of Spain. You can see it in Italy. You can see it right across Europe in trying to organise if you like, populist nationalists everywhere. I used to say that I'd seen a poster in a demonstration, worldwide campaign against globalization. And this is a sort of worldwide campaign of anti-internationalists against internationalism. And we have not found a way, as you rightly say, of fighting it, and we have to find a way. In Canada, Trudeau was denied a majority because of Quebec nationalists. In Spain, Pedro Sanchez, as I say, was denied a majority because of the Catalonian and the Vox party in Spain. And right across Europe, you will see that these nationalist movements are preventing a left-wing government being formed. You've got ADF in Germany that got up to 15%. You've obviously got Le Pen in France, and it's possible that Salvini will be back in power in Italy. So we've got to recognise that this is, as I was trying to say, an international phenomenon we've got to deal with. And it's in some way, it's about elites. It's about people saying that the Labour Party and the Conservative Party are elites. One's a professional elite, the other is a business elite, run out of London, out of touch, patronising, they accuse us and others of being to people out in the regions. And that's why, Charlie, I don't think the constitutional and economic answers are separate. I think if you're talking about the regions in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, yes, economic insecurity we need, and we could have a long discussion about what I think we should do about that, and there's a huge number of changes that I would make from things that we did in government, and we've had to learn. But I do say one thing, that if we're going to deal with child poverty, I just repeat this, yes, you can raise child benefit, but the way to get millions out of poverty, we've got 2 million children out of poverty, is child tax credits. And what's happening at the moment is we are virtually silent as child tax credits have been integrated into universal credit, and now the numbers of children in poverty have gone up from 3 million to 4 million. They will be 5 million in 2022, and that is far higher than ever anything that happened during the Thatcher major years. And Kate's here and led Child Poverty Action Group, and she knows that this worsening scandal of child poverty in our country that is going to rise very substantially over the next few years. There was nothing said other than a 35p rise in child benefit in the Conservative manifesto about that, so they're putting billions across the country, but more children are being in poverty, and we've got a campaign on that issue and campaign effectively over the next few months. But what people, I think, are complaining about is that they feel that we are elites who are running out of touch with them, and we have got to prove that we are in touch, but you cannot prove that if you just give resources. You've got to talk about people having their voice and being heard, not just us telling them, but us listening to them. I remember I was in George Bush's office, believe it or not, in the height of the financial crisis, and I was trying to tell him that we had to do something about the banks, and he was saying she wasn't sure. And he said, no, the big issue, he said, is Obama. He said, Obama is trying to become president. He said, you know, he went down and made this speech, he said, and talked about people clinging to guns and clinging to religion as their answer to the problems that they were facing. You know, and he actually, to be fair to him, predicted that someone like Trump would be president after him at some point. He said, populism is rising in this country. He said, the way to get Obama, he said, call him a Harvard elitist. And I said, that's a bit much. I mean, you were at Yale. And his line was, populism, you fight by attacking the elites. And we have fallen into the trap of being seen sometimes and unfairly as one of the elites, and we've got to do something about it. Ian is not only the sole Labour MP in Scotland, but he's one who's constantly increased his majority by tremendous campaigning in South Edinburgh, which I may say I was a candidate in 1979, and I do applaud you because I couldn't win it, and you did win it, and that was one of the great successes to get South Edinburgh as a Labour campaign. I remember going to see someone about 9:30, I think it was the night of the election in 1979. This old lady hadn't voted, and a guy called Alistair Moffat, who was head of the Edinburgh Fringe, and I went round to see this lady at 9:30 to get her out to vote, thinking that we had a chance of winning. And Alistair, in frustrated because she wouldn't come out and vote. Don't you realise this could be the last chance you have of voting? She did come out to vote. I think we lost. Anyway, we lost it. But Ian, you've done a great job. But what you're saying about Scotland and about taking on nationalism is incredibly important. I just want people to see that when the nationalists present themselves as some sort of social democratic party, that there's some rainbow alliance with nationalists and Labour that is possible in the United Kingdom. But the Nationalists have no policy to abolish poverty.
Yeah.
They have no policy to reduce inequality. They've messed up the National Health Service in Scotland in a way that is completely soul-destroying. The education, my children at school in Scotland, the education system is falling apart in Scotland. And this is supposed to be the epitome of a social democratic party running Scotland. Inequality, poverty will survive until doomsday if the Nationalist Party are the people who are confronting it. And I think we have to recognise that they are not the radicals that they present themselves to be in Westminster. But what we have to do, and this is where I conclude, and it was made by about hope, and hope is what we've got to be able to give people. I knew Nelson Mandela and was very fortunate to meet him on many, many occasions. And some of you may have heard that he came to London for his 90th birthday. And he was celebrating his 90th birthday and trying to raise money for his favourite charities, which was helping kids to get education in Africa. And so he donated this letter that he'd written, Nelson Mandela's Letter to a Child, and it was in his own writing. And he put it up for auction. And he had all the stars of Hollywood there. You had Will Smith was the auctioneer until they sacked him because he was incoherent. They had Forrest Whitaker there, Emma Thompson was there, I remember. Elton John was there, you had Oprah Winfrey there. And so they were bidding for this thing. Bill Clinton was there. They were bidding for this thing. And it got up to 405,000, 600,000, out of order, ridiculous figures, 600,000. And then at 600,000, everybody pulled out except Oprah Winfrey and Elton John. And so Oprah Winfrey was debating with Elton John who would get it. Oprah goes to 700,000, Elton John goes to 800,000, Oprah to 900,000, Elton goes to $1 million. At 1.1 million, Elton pulls out, Oprah gets it, and then you can see her face as it was explained to her that she was paying in pounds and not dollars. But Mandela's message that night was that in his prison cell, he had this facsimile of a painting that is actually in the Tate Gallery, and it's called Hope. And the painting called Hope was done by a British artist called Frederick Watts, famous British artist. He actually painted two of the same picture, and there's one in the government art collection. And that painting looks, when you look at it at the first point, the first time, it looks like desolation, not hope. Because it's a young girl who's blinded, trying to play a harp with all its strings broken. You think impossible. You think desolation. You can't do it. And then the message from Mandela is very clear. Even in situations that seem hopeless, you've got to retain hope. Even in situations that are the most difficult, you've got to rebuild hope. Even in situations where you're set back and things look as if you're never going to be able to recover, you've got to give people hope. And I think that in the wake of a defeat, it is our job, as Chris was saying, and Chris Bryant has written a lot about this, we have got to give people hope. And the hope is that you can actually talk about values in this country. I don't believe that you can't talk about values. We've got to make cooperation come alive. We've got to make solidarity come alive. You can think of every instance where you're dealing with a problem at the moment as an MP or an assistant of an MP, and how that can be translated into a message about hope. I still deal with lots of people, and you can help an individual person, and they can actually feel that something is being done with them and on their behalf. You are actually giving people hope. When I'm involved with the United Nations as a special envoy, hope does not just die when boats are lost at sea and refugees are trying to escape, or when a food convoy doesn't get through to people who are in need of it. Hope dies when kids cannot get the chance of an education, cannot plan and prepare for the future, and we're trying to give them the chance of that education. In every situation, we've got to show not only where the principles of cooperation and solidarity work, but we've actually got to give people hope for the future. I think we have a chance to rebuild. I think the reason is, as I've been trying to explain, that Boris Johnson cannot claim that he's got a majority for conservative values. We can claim that people in this country are not at ease with the country and want to see real change. We can be the party that actually proposes what that change should be. And yes, it's economic security that we've got to be able to offer. And yes, we've got to answer the questions that people have about what's happening to the communities and how they feel fed up with what's going on as they lose community facility after community facility. and the high streets are boarded up. But yes, also, we've got to say that we are not going to dictate to people what their future is. We are going to give people a voice and allow them to make decisions about their future. Now, if we can combine our commitment to solidarity, cooperation, reciprocity with practical policies that actually can deliver that for the future, then not only can we hold the United Kingdom together, which and I know people who are here, believe is the most important thing, because there cannot easily be a Labour government without Scotland in particular returning to the Labour Party, but we can also rebuild the United Kingdom around the principles that we hold dear. Thank you very much.
2010, when I was first elected, everybody told me that winning in Wirral South, which is a marginal seat that never had an opposition member before, everybody told me that it was a hopeless battle and that I would never win. Well, I've always had Gordon by my side helping me, and I have learned that with Gordon there is always hope. So thank you all for coming today. It's been a great pleasure. Will you join me once more in thanking Mr. Gordon?
What's that? Yeah.